Hi everyone, I'm Madeleine and I started my PhD this January, working with the Arctic Cabo project. I'm in Mark Bellin's lab at the University of Sherbrooke, also working with Isla Myers-Smith at the University of Edinburgh. Today, today I'm just going to talk a bit about what I had planned for my project and about some field work that I was able to do this summer. So as I mentioned, I'm working at the higher latitude sites. So Peaky Park is the Arctic Cabo site in the northern part of the Yukon Territory, where Isla's group, Team Shrub, have been working for many years, and there's long-term ecological and phenological monitoring there. The field work for that has been postponed a couple times because of COVID, but this summer I was able to do some field work in the southern part of the territory in the Yukon. So I'm just going to go over some important changes occurring in the Arctic for biodiversity monitoring, and then talk about remote sensing in the Arctic before getting into kind of the research questions that I'm interested in, looking at using hyperspectral imaging to predict tundra plant biodiversity and the role of phenology. So the Arctic is warming at over twice the rate of the rest of the planet, which has important consequences for Arctic ecosystems, influencing things like nutrient cycling, plant community composition, as well as having feedbacks to the global carbon cycle. Roughly 2/3 of the world's soil carbon are stored in high latitude ecosystems, and that carbon is vulnerable to being released as temperatures rise and permafrost thaws. So one notable ecological change that has been observed across the Arctic are shifts in plant community composition. And so overall, there's an increase in plant cover, particularly with sedges, grasses, and shrubs, and a reduction in bare ground and some lichen species. And so these observations are consistent at Peaky Park, that Arctic site as well, where these observations are over the last 2 decades of their vegetation monitoring, where they've seen that increase in shrubs, sedges, grasses, and a reduction in bare ground over both the dominant vegetation types on the island. So one noteworthy example of vegetation change is shrubification. So the increased abundance and growth of woody plants, particularly tall deciduous shrubs, and the advancement of shrub lines. So these changes aren't unique to the tundra. A recent synthesis looked at shrubification in the savanna and tundra biomes. So any blue dots are areas where there's been shrubification. And so under warmer conditions, often these tall deciduous shrubs can outcompete other plant functional types, and they cause complex feedback loops with the ecosystem. So altering things like snowpack dynamics, shrubs increase the amount of snow that accumulates in the winter that can then lead to incubation of the soil and further decomposition, as well as changing surface albedo and litter inputs. Functional plant traits can be used as a tool to predict how communities will respond to warming, but a better understanding of the traits underlying plant responses in tundra ecosystems is needed to better predict how plant communities will respond to environmental changes. So plant trait variation within communities is a result of differences both between species and among species. So another biome-wide synthesis project looked at changing plant functional traits at sites across the Arctic, including Peaky Park. And so at the community scale, plant height has been increasing over the past several years. And this is driven by taller grasses and sedges and shrubs moving into long-term vegetation monitoring plots. So the last major change I'll talk about is changing timing of life cycle events, or phenology. The Arctic is characterized by a very short growing season, and so any changes to this have important consequences for plant communities. The drivers of phenology are complex, and shifts in the growing season length and timing of environmental cues like temperature and snowmelt don't neatly map on to phenological phase, but generally there's a consensus that green up is occurring earlier, but there's more uncertainty surrounding later stage phenological phases, particularly senescence, which, as the leaves turn color, you can imagine has important consequences for looking at reflectance patterns. Arctic remote sensing has to date mostly relied on satellite observations, that use relatively coarse resolution sensors. And so over the last several decades, there's been this observation that the Arctic is greening, looking at increasing NDVI trends. So both the Arctic sites are indicated by the stars there, but there is heterogeneity in this signal, and it's often difficult to compare between sensors. And so the Arctic is also browning. In certain regions, there have been trends where NDVI is decreasing. And so the lack of field data, in part due to logistical challenges of biodiversity monitoring in tundra systems, because of the short growing season, because of cost of access in remote sites, leads there to be still quite a bit of uncertainty around ecological change. And landscape level data collection, particularly hyperspectral data across different scales, will help us better understand the drivers of ecological change and trends like Arctic greening and browning. So to date, there hasn't been a lot of optical sensing work done in the Arctic, as I mentioned, but some early work done by Alison Beamish and others in Alaska looked at using these tools to discriminate common tundra vegetation communities, and they found they were effectively able to do so, and the patterns they observed were sensitive to phenological phase. Their work suggested that senescence was the most discriminative phase, but more research is needed, and it's unclear how much variation occurs over the short growing season. So a better understanding of the variation could improve our ability to discriminate species and vegetation communities. So this summer, I was very fortunate enough to spend a couple months in the southern part of the Yukon Territory, Phenology, working at tundra alpine sites, which is about 1,000 kilometers south of the Arctic Peaky Park northern site. And so we worked in two setups in a common garden, as well as along an elevational transect. And we looked at tundra willow plant traits and took leaf level hyperspectral images over the summer. So this is what the common garden looks like from above. And so it was set up in 2013 by Isla's group Team Shrub to look at questions of local adaptation and phenotype plasticity. So a challenge in predicting how tundra plant communities will change as the environment changes is determining the degree to which plant trait variation is due to genetic differences or to whether plants are responding plastically to their environment. So the question for the garden is, how will tundra, alpine, and Arctic willows respond when they're grown in a warmer and common environment? This is what the garden looks like now. There are about 220 individuals in the garden, ranging between 3 different willow species, all of which are undergoing range expansion in the Western Arctic and contributing to that shrubification signal. And so the willows were sampled from individuals growing at the northern Arctic Peaky Park site, as well as at the southern alpine Kluane site. And then they've been grown together in this warmer common garden since 2013, where plant traits, survival rates, and growth have been monitored since then. So I'm also interested in this question of phenological variation in tundra plant reflectance patterns over a growing season. So we also worked along an elevational gradient. This is the Kluane Plateau, and about halfway up is tree line. And so above tree line this summer at different elevations, we looked at the same 3 willow species over the growing season. There was considerable variation in shrub cover. So at the lower sites, this is just above tree line here in this corner, shrubs were relatively dense and often taller than me. But as you moved up the mountain, vegetation became more sparse, and there was quite a bit of snow, especially early in the summer. Anywhere higher than where Isla and I are sitting in that bottom corner was totally covered in snow by the end of June, and we weren't able to access the higher sites until early mid-July. So sampling these willows along the gradient allowed us to expand our timing of phenological phase. By the end of June, all the willows in the common garden were fully leafed out and beautiful shades of green, as were the willows at this lower elevation. But at the higher sites, on the same day, you can see that the buds were still beginning to disperse through, and the higher sites above this were still covered in snow. So for all of the willows, we took leaf level hyperspectral measurements using an integrating sphere and a leaf clip 3 times for individuals in the garden and 4 or 5 times for individuals along the mountain. And we also took some plant trait measurements, measuring some things in the field like specific leaf area and plant height, as well as bringing samples back to Quebec to analyze for nutrient content and pigment content. So the next steps are to complete all the lab work and jump into the data. These are some of the spectra we collected from Salix pulchra, one of the willow species in the garden. And so the green are individuals from the southern alpine tundra sites, Peaky, and then the blue are from individuals from northern Arctic sites, Peaky Park. And so you can see in August, there's this clear separation between the northern and southern willows. And this is when all of the northern willows from the Arctic were senescing already, and the leaves were different shades of yellow and brown and actively falling off the shrub whenever you would bump it, while the southern willows were still very green and had that kind of classic willow look to them. So scaling up from leaf to landscape level observation, I'm interested in similar questions about using hyperspectral imaging to discriminate tundra vegetation communities and not just species, and again returning to this question of phenology. And so I plan to use airborne hyperspectral data, hopefully across different scales, to look at vegetation discrimination. So right now, there is airborne hyperspectral data that was collected by the NASA Above project in 2019. They flew over the island twice at the beginning and end of July, pardon me. And at the end of July is already when the island is undergoing senescence and the plants are turning color because it is such a short growing season. And so I'm hoping to use these data and compare them to existing vegetation maps on the island to see if we can effectively discriminate tundra vegetation communities and also look at the role of how phenology influences that. So existing hyperspectral work that's done in the Arctic has noted several intrinsic tundra ecosystem components that make using remote sensing difficult and that you have to consider. So that's a high amount of bare ground coverage, very variable moisture levels in standing water, as well as standing litter that's common across the landscapes. So there has been some preliminary plot level hyperspectral work done over the summers in 2017 and 2018, comparing 2 of the dominant vegetation types on the island, Herschel and Kanakuk. And these measurements were taken using a field spectroradiometer attached to a probe, and they held it a certain height off the ground and took repeated measurements in a grid formation and compiled it that way. And so these are some of their results. Overall, they observed similar reflectance patterns between both the communities, but more variation in the Kanakuk community, which is also more functionally diverse. So I'm hoping to build upon this data and return to this question of if we can effectively discriminate tundra species and tundra vegetation types using hyperspectral imaging and how that changes with phenology to best allow us to predict patterns of tundra plant biodiversity. So with that, that's everything. I'm really excited to hopefully get to go to the Arctic and continue with kind of the Arctic Cabo site. So thank you so much.